after this long and interesting panel. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Thierry. I'm the chairman of Meridiam and also of the Long-Term Infrastructure Investor Association. Welcome to this Paris InfraWeek, the third edition, but also a special welcome to the members of LTIA that will also have their annual meeting this afternoon, and coming from Japan, our colleagues from Japan or California and everything in between. And also a special welcome to Meridiam, because I think GIH is bringing an interesting contribution from the G20 on infrastructure. Indeed, the G20 has been talking about infrastructure for at least 5 or 6 years, I guess, since Russia, under different names and objectives, and there's always a big debate on the communique about whether we call it quality, inclusive, long-term, sustainable. I think we've seen it all. But at the end of the day, what are we focusing on? We're focusing on infrastructure that actually make cities and countries resilient, and I think that's very important in the context of climate change in relation to severe climate events. We talked about hurricanes and others, but droughts and all of those will have a severe effect. The second is infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure, and what does that mean to me is addressing all the SDGs to the extent possible. I mean, of course, there are actually some sustainable development goals that are directly addressing infrastructure, like, number 7 with clean energy and access to clean energy, or number 9, which is actually about infrastructure and resilient infrastructure, but as well sustainable cities and others. But that's a key piece of what sustainable infrastructure is about. So my first point would be that, how does SDG sort of fit in with it after what I've just said? And to me, addressing SDG while creating infrastructure or investing in infrastructure is really a key to rebuild the trust with society. And we're really talking about something which is slightly deeper than just financing or building new infrastructure. Those SDGs there are covering about everything we need in terms of the goals for 2030 and 2050, and addressing those is quite important. And there are a number of ways we could do that. I think I first like to mention the initiative under Paris Europlace that is Finance for Tomorrow. And what we're trying to do in there is really obviously addressing climate action through financing, but also addressing an inclusive transition, because that's an important piece about going to a low-carbon economy without necessarily negatively affecting populations and others. So it's quite key for Finance for Tomorrow to focus on that inclusive transition. But it's also the role of all of us, investors, contractors, industry, in terms of contributing to this SDG. So, I mean, we did have a new law pact passed to encourage people to actually define their mission and their raison d'être and others. But despite the fact that you may not want to do that, it's important in every organization that you actually define your goals in terms of your contribution to SDG. It's a great way to motivate the teams. It's a great way to find a purpose for them. And nowadays, if you want to hire any millennial, actually, if you don't have a purpose, it's quite difficult to do so. So that's one way of doing it, but it's also a way to define a purpose for your own company. The second aspect of that is that focusing on those goals actually will help us focus together on how to create a market, because addressing the ecological transition is not something that you do with a magic wand, because we're all starting from a point where small projects, new issues, interfaces in different sectors are quite key in terms of addressing those. We're talking a bit earlier at the table of energy efficiency. How do you go for non-fossil fuels? it's quite difficult at the end of the day, and I think we have to recognize the difficulty, which means more energy in terms of addressing this. So addressing SDGs also means that you're able to measure the impact that you create, because we can talk about it forever, and I think there is always a tendency to discuss volume, especially at policy levels where all governments self-congratulate themselves because they issued a bunch of green bonds. The question is, what do you do with it, and what is the impact that you've actually created in terms of climate action, but in terms of other SDGs as well? I mean, there's been quite a number, and measuring is about measuring the real impact, and that does take a long time. There are quite a number of initiatives over the years, and I should mention at least a couple. The one that we have with AFD and La Banque Postale in terms of measuring our portfolio are actually targeting the Paris target. There's also, importantly, what LTI had initially financed, helped finance, is the benchmarking for infrastructure investment. And I must say that I've already told Eric that I was quite disappointed that they rushed into conclusions to say that ESG had no impact on volatility and returns, but I think they should go back to the table and actually get real data to be able to show us how actually ESG and SDGs can contribute to a lower volatility and better sustainable return for investors. Last, I would like to speak a little bit about the regulators and the public sector in general as asset owners. I think one of the big challenge that we have, and to say things bluntly, is they often fail to be consistent. The right leg and the left leg doesn't quite talk to each other in many issues, and that does create a few gaps in the policy in terms of providing the incentive, but the enabling environment to actually allow ourselves and others to invest more in infrastructure that are resilient and sustainable. I mean, I will take one example, which is the topic of transition. There is quite a tendency, and I'm referring to the European Commission initiative on taxonomy, which I welcome. However, we have to remember this is a transition to a low-carbon economy. So it doesn't happen overnight from one state to the other. I'm not advocating for a slow transition. I'm advocating for a realistic transition, and one that remains inclusive. I was listening to Ambroise actually earlier talking about the board of the EIB and the fact that, you know, gas may not be an investable instrument. Indeed, when I read the report from the International Energy Agency, gas is part of a solution to the Paris target in the next 10, 20 years. So obviously, gas has a role to play in storage, a role to play in resilience of system, and of course, I'm not saying we should all invest in gas. I'm saying that there are things that are very difficult to handle with a black and white taxonomy, and then one should be very careful about not killing the entire market by trying to be black and white. The other point that I would like to make is, and that was very well made here by both Ambroise and Meridiam, is the capacity of governments to do two things. I mean, to produce sustainable pipelines that are credible, that investors can invest in. And I think a number of the MDBs are providing support to those governments, and that's quite good. But also a capacity in terms of actually addressing one SDG, which is the 17, partnering. There is still among certain countries a certain dogma about partnering with civil society, government with civil society, despite what they say, and government with private sector in terms of delivering infrastructure. And it's fundamental that we actually manage this partnership over the long term. And I'm actually talking about my own country, where there's always a recurrent report from the Court of Auditors that say, oh, it's really bad to involve private sector in infrastructure at any point. But that is not true. Of course, private sector is not a magic one to solve infrastructure, but partnering in the right basis would be quite interesting. And the last point in terms of consistency that I would mention is exactly what was said earlier. We should stop giving ourselves volume goals, and we should stop focusing about actual impact goals when it comes to carbon, when it comes to the positive impact that we can have on society, but that infrastructure can have on the economy, on the resilience of cities and countries. And to finish here, I should mention the sort of the elephant in the room, in particular in Europe, where we talk about a lot of things, but we refuse to almost talk about carbon pricing, which is the underlying issue that has been lingering for quite a while in terms of supporting a business and an economy that would actually transfer to a low-carbon economy. We do have ETS, and we focus on that, but one of the major, especially in Europe, I can mention, one of the major contributors of carbon in Europe is transport, but that's all delegated to member states. And member states have this inability to actually tax carbon in transport in a transparent way that is understandable by society, and then that creates quite a lot of issues. I won't remind you of the certain issues we had in France on a particular carbon tax on fuel, but it's true everywhere. And the European Commission, being involved in a way in big industry and energy for the main system, has somehow forgotten that member states need to coordinate and be more transparent about how they tax carbon in the major contributors of pollution in Europe. On those words, I'll wish you a very good InfraWeek, and hope a number of ideas and will come up out of these discussions. And more than ideas, I think meeting people and engaging into initiatives to actually do things is the best you can do. Thank you.